Hello, and welcome to the debut edition of the Poets Cafe. My name is Kathy Purnell, and I'll be your host for this evening. The Poets Cafe generally aims to provide a forum for local poets to come and discuss their views on poetry and to perform their work live for the residents of Tompkins County. Our special guest this evening is William R. Craft, Jr., a poet and novelist who currently resides in the Ithaca area. And tonight he will be reading some of his work and will share his thoughts on the development of poetry in the 1990s. Good evening, William, and welcome to the cafe.
It's good to be here. Like you said, I just recently moved into the area, and I'm really looking towards saying whatever I have to say tonight.
Well, as you noted, that was actually one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is. You've recently moved to Ithaca from the Washington, D.C. area, as I understand it. How has this move or transition influenced your writing? Do you find that the poetry scenes in Ithaca and D.C. are significantly different from one another? And if so, what are some of those differences?
The poetry scene in Ithaca, the mere fact that there is something you could cause a scene is a difference in D.C. DC, you have isolated bands of like these artsy coffee houses and places like that. While in Ithaca, I believe it's a more receptive area to poetry. And I think it would be a better place, not just for a poet, but for any type of author or writer to write.
More specifically, though, have you found that that the people are different? Like, what sort of things have made you feel that Ithacans are more receptive to poetry than persons
obviously,
in the DC area?
the obvious difference is Ithaca is not as political as DC. A lot of times in DC, as in any major city, people are too busy to, slow down and appreciate, some of the more, important things in life, I guess I would say.
Oh. So let's discuss some of these, some of the works that you've been currently working on.
Okay.
Reviewing my notes from our pre-interview, I remember that you had mentioned the fact that you had, in less than a year's time, and I think this is somewhat impressive, had published 3 chapbooks and had compiled a full-length collection of poetry entitled The Asylum.
Yeah, that is correct.
What are some of your more recent projects, either in the local area that you've been working on, or books or that you've been trying to put out?
I've been working on and off ever since August of '94 on 2 collections, one titled Dawn and one titled Progression, and I'm still going to be working on those until I feel that they are ready to be put out, and I just don't feel that yet. And Dawn, interestingly enough, is my first venture into what someone might call light poetry. It's not as dark as the earlier works, because the early works, anyone who read them could identify easily that they were dark works.
And are there any other poetry projects in the Ithaca area, let's say publicly, that you've been working on?
I've gone to a couple open poetry readings at local establishments, and currently I'm working in a BOCES workshop. And the biggest surprise to me was when I got to this workshop, the quality of the talent of the other poets. Because I just, I go there, I could just sit there and be quiet and just listen to their poems. I never hardly say, anything. I just go there.
You're not critical at all of the other poetry, or I'm not quite sure.
Well, not really. I just sit there and I try to appreciate the poetry, and I'm just astonished because I think that all of the other members of this workshop are good poets, although none of them have a style even close to mine.
And what do you think best classifies or categorizes your style at this point in time?
My style? It changes daily.
Right, I was about to say, that's sort of what I wanted to see if you could pin it down.
My style pretty much stays the same, but the content of my poems, it's all about, what I'm thinking at the very moment I write it. Like I could write 3 dark poems a day and then write 3 light ones, the same day. It's all dependent on my frame of mind. But I'm a free-form poet now, more than than one who rhymes.
Right, because actually both of those issues were ones that I sort of want to tease out a little bit, because both of those, both the different ways in which you seem to experiment with form and style, as well as your book Dawn, both of those for me seem to be two striking aberrations in your poetical development or in your works. Maybe we can first talk about Dawn. Dawn does appear to be an exceptional work because it does seem to embrace a much more positive perspective on life. I mean, I guess this might be what you were referring to when you said that they seem to be lighter poems. Because from what I remember, the poems in Zero, Evolution, Asylum, those all deal very beautifully with some very dark and deep themes like alienation, fears of loss, unrequited love, the death of persons that were close to you. And Inside the Matrix also, which doesn't directly deal with those themes, but as you put it, you felt that work dealt more directly with the issue of mind control. Poems like Thought and Suppression to Repression all seem to emphasize the importance of individual thought and self-assertion, but at the same time you seem to adopt a very pessimistic view. You don't seem as hopeful or as optimistic as maybe someone like myself would be that individuals can sort of exercise free thought or challenge themselves to think independently. Why exactly did you write Dawn? I mean, did this work reflect some fundamental change on your outlook on life? I mean, why did you start to write more lighter poetry? And if it doesn't seem to reflect a fundamental change on your outlook, what sort of factors motivated you to write that particular book?
Well, Dawn in particular. I wrote Zero, Inside the Matrix, Evolution, and the 7 poems, that were included in the Asylum, and they're all basically dealing with certain central themes. Mm-hmm. And after a certain time, you just get tired of doing the same thing over and over again. So I wanted to experiment with something new, was one thing. And the second factor was I had some adverse, reaction to some of my poetry, and I felt, and I didn't want to feel responsible for someone else's depression. That's all I needed was to feel responsible for someone else's depression.
Do you actually have? Why would?
Interestingly enough, yes.
Okay.
I still am. Well, not as much anymore, but active with internet poetry.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Right.
And I was talking to one person one day on the internet, and he told me how he liked, my collection, the Asylum, because he obtained a copy. Mm-hmm. And he said that it made his choice very clear. And this was mysterious to me. Part of me didn't want to know what he was talking about, but part did. And then I finally contacted him through means, and he said that his choice to end his life was clear, and I didn't want to be responsible for anyone making decisions like that. And I realize most people say that's not the artist's responsibility, but still, you feel responsible. Just as an end note, the person did not kill themselves.
And you frequently corresponded
with
this person?
I still do.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, I can definitely see how your poetry, I don't, as you pointed out, I don't think that it's necessarily the artist's responsibility or that the artist should necessarily feel guilty for how individuals interpret or act on their poetry or what they read, but I can definitely see how individuals could sort of empathize, if they are depressed or if they are feeling disillusioned with the world or with themselves, how they can find those sort of themes in your poetry to sort of, in my case, I feel that a lot of your poetry, even when it deals with very dark themes, there even seems to be a very positive, there always seems to be some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Not in all of them, but definitely in one of your works, namely Eulogy, that I remember was in one of your first collections, you had talked specifically about how that you thought you were being called to give a eulogy for a friend, and you thought that friend was emotion. But then in a sudden twist at the end of the poem, you tell the reader that the person that you're bearing is not actually emotion, but is depression. And so when I read that, I sort of felt that, it seemed to be an instance where you were working through some sort of emotional
Yeah.
trials or difficulties, and then finally at the end you manage to bury it in some way, or recognize that you've been working through them to bury it.
Well, specifically in that poem, it deals with how things aren't necessarily as they seem.
Right, okay.
Like you might be like saying, I'm not going to get involved with anybody anymore. I'm going to be cold and distant. But at the same time, I think when you do this, maybe you could be fooling yourself and just putting the bad things behind you and moving forward. And maybe this going cold for a certain amount of time is part of that. And I think that's what that poem deals with.
Deals with
Putting things behind you.
you, right.
Yes. And how they're not always as they seem.
Right. You had mentioned that you met this person on the internet. I myself met you or first became familiar with your work through the internet, or by
Yes.
viewing your worldwide web page and chatting with you on various groups on the internet. What are some of your thoughts about the internet as an emerging form, as an emerging place where poets can come to post and exchange poetry and discuss poetry? I mean, do you find that it's a very, what are some of the positives or negatives through dealing with the internet?
I think the best thing about the internet is cowards can go on there, people who really don't want to go out in public. And the coward's probably the best way to put it. That was a little bit...
That might be a bit strong.
That's probably a bit strong. But people can go out there and they don't have to worry about public embarrassment. They can post their work and they get a basic feeling of how people feel. Now, this can be a good thing, but at the same time it can be a very bad thing, because people, you don't know people, so they can be ruthless to you and very, and they can just tear your work to pieces, then shut off their computer and go to bed. And it's a good thing, but it's a great environment, because you get to go to a chat room with people who are interested in poetry, and you can talk to them, and you can read your work, and you can read their work, and I think it helps you very much grow as an artist, very much.
It's refreshing to hear positive, feedback on the internet, because you hear so much negative press now, surrounding the internet about, persons going on and, potentially, doing morally adverse things on the internet.
Well,
and so I think it's refreshing to hear, positive feedback on the internet and how it can be used as a literary form, which is essentially...
I think the internet is like all things. The only things that are going to stick in people's minds are the bad things that come about. People aren't going to really emphasize on anything else.
And where is your webpage exactly for persons who might...
Good. That's
it's
a very
changed
good
the
question.
addresses, right?
Right now, it's www.clark.net/pub/Shivato, and that's spelled Chivato, and that's my webpage with all my poetry on it.
And when you say all your poetry, are these even selections from your unpublished works?
Yes,
or?
I even have the new stuff on there,
Okay.
if anyone is interested.
Okay, let me see. Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your essay, the Poetry in the 90s essay, which is your critical work on poetry, or in particular, Generation X poetry, I think, and how people tend to classify our generation or the poets of our generation. One of the things that you discussed, or one quote that I found particularly compelling, was the following, and I quote, "What the poet must do is learn how to tap his or her emotions without becoming overcome by these emotions. All great poetry comes from the soul. All great poets must know how to access their soul without being destroyed by emotion." When I read that, I thought that it seemed compelling to me, because when I read your poetry, a lot of your poetry does seem to be confessional poetry. I mean, you do seem to be working through a lot of personal issues through your poetry. It just made me wonder, what are some of the emotions that have posed the biggest challenges to you as a writer or poet that you felt that you were conquering through your work or through writing?
Well, the ones that I was conquering are probably the easiest to write poems on, actually, because the hardest things, the things that just stay there and and they're always there, they're the easiest things to write poetry about, because they're always there. What you have to know how to do, as I tried to say, is access these things and go like think about these things, but not, totally be destroyed by these things, because that's very possible. And I personally am a follower of the Blake philosophy that the road to the Golden Palace is paved with excess, and I believe that that's part of that as well.
And what is the excess, or what does it mean to indulge in, or to be excessive?
Well,
for you, anyway.
For me,
yeah.
Well, I toyed around with different things as far as the excess, and usually I found if you deprive yourself of like sleep, for instance.
Okay.
And this is probably going to sound a bit weird, but if you deprive yourself of sleep, the moment before you go to sleep, you might be able to get a great line, great inspiration from somewhere, and the excess is, being tired. And there's some people that would use different forms of the excess, like alcohol or drugs or anything like that. And I have tried the alcohol, but that just, when you do that, it's about 98% of everything you do is like garbage. And you might have 2% that's good. But I think Blake was right, and I personally don't have the guts to try out his experiment about excess, his theory about excess, but I believe he was correct.
Now, you mentioned Blake, and one of the questions that I had when I read some of the titles and lines of your poetry were, what are some of the poets that you found to be influential to you or to your work? I asked this question in particular because at the end of the show I know that we're playing a sound clip from the Soft Parade, or the Doors'
Yes.
Soft Parade, and you thought that would be an appropriate way to close the show. How has Jim Morrison influenced your work? I mean, he seems to be clearly a big influence for you. I remember several lines from some of your poems seem to be directly inspired by
Yes.
either songs that he's written or from his album, The American Poet.
Yeah, well, to start with, my influences, they start with the beat poets.
Okay.
I mean, because like Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and and that generation, I think that they were very good poets, but as most anyone would admit, but they're really not too accepted. I don't feel anymore. They're thought to be like, it's really hard to explain, but I don't believe the beat poets are accepted as much as they were 30 years ago.
In the mainstream? Or?
Yeah, well, not necessarily the mainstream, just in like poetry circles. But that's my own personal impression and no one else's. Besides that, I like Blake, as I mentioned, and of course I was heavily influenced by Jim Morrison, or his poetry named James Douglas Morrison. And he wrote in his works that he wanted he didn't want to be known as Jim Morrison when he wrote poetry.
Oh, really?
He wanted to be James Douglas Morrison because he wanted that to be, he didn't want that to have anything to do with the Doors or his career in music. He wanted the poetry to be separate. And that's why I think it's very important to separate the two people. And I think most poets, or anyone who writes poetry, could say that when you write poetry, you take on a different persona. And I think that's why a poet can understand why he wanted to differentiate between Jim Morrison and James Douglas Morrison.
So do you embody two different personae when you write, or?
Well, not when I write. It's one persona,
Okay.
and then I have a second persona, and and I'm not schizophrenic or anything like that. It's just when you write, like Jim Morrison and Blake said, you have to go to excess, and maybe this excess is what leads into the second persona.
Okay. Okay, we're going to need to wrap this up because I want to make sure that we have time for you to perform some of your work.
Okay.
But the last question that maybe you can address briefly in a couple of seconds is, there's a quote that's in your essay that talks about a poetry revolution. And one of the things that essay had made me keenly aware of was that poetry is simultaneously both a deeply personal, but also potentially, it's deeply personal, but it has very strong social potentials for change and rebellion. As you put it, you say that you consider yourself to be cutting edge, that you hope to expose the masses to poetry, after all, I am an average guy, a Joe Six-Pack. And then you say, my poetry is about my frame of mind. But then you shift and you start talking about how that you're now trying to start a poetic revolution, that poetry is more than rhyming words, it's pain, it's realism. What would this revolution look like, and
Well,
do you think that we're progressing towards it now? Or?
I think you see things that are evident of it every day.
Okay.
Because, like, there's always in every major city, this country, there's a rise in the number of poetry places that read poetry, and this is not just some yuppie phenomenon. It's a real thing, and people are starting to recognize poetry once again as an art form. And I believe that anyone could see that poetry is a lot bigger than it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And I personally don't think that I could start any poetry revolution or anything like that. I was probably I really don't know what I was doing.
Well, maybe perhaps that you're going to be a big part of this revolution. And
I would like to, but
right.
That's really not for me to decide.
Okay, well, at this point in time, we're going to take a very short break where we're going to list some of the upcoming events, poetry events in the Ithaca area. And after the break, we'll return and have William Craft read some of his work.
I will read a group of poems tonight. The first one that I'm going to read is titled The Village. Vicious beasts run down from their glorious groves. They arrive in the village in murderous droves. They devour the innocent with demented glee. Only a fortunate few are permitted to flee. As the survivors reach the neighboring village, the unfortunate dead are paid heroic homage. The second poem that I will read is entitled Self-Portrait. I drink so I can deal with assholes. This includes me. Do you believe in fear? I love this stinking place. I'll never be alive alone again. Free the chains that imprison me. My cage is made of concrete. My heart screams the rage. Eyes are seeing the truth, or I think so. Do you feel rage? Question reality or doubt it? Do you think I speak the truth, or am I just stammering about? Don't ignore your brain. Just talk to the masses and speak of the forgotten fools. Dead heroes make noble idols. Do you fear me, or do I fear me? Think of reality as challenging the brain. Cerebral cortex bleeds madness. Goodbye. I'll see you on the other side of madness. Faded pictures. Faded pictures losing memories of a time I can't remember. Last week, it was 2 years ago. Can you help me recall the future and observe a procession of madness, festival of lost lives, and my insane background? The play. I find myself as an actor, in life. Will you be my co-star, friend? I hate the questions. I reveal insane poems. The puzzle fits. Or does it question authority? Who were you when the play began? Can you be my friend? I doubt it. You probably hate me. I'm not insane, just confused. Frenzy of screams, silence. The curtain rises. Act 1. I step forth into the theater of living. The stage is experience, the acting is giving. My life is filled with emptiness, full of depression. The poetry is the priest, my venue is confession. I shall continue, I shall go on, continue my pain, fighting aimlessly, existing in vain. Act 2. Again I find myself in a familiar place. My body no longer hungers, my soul is filled with grace. The visions I have are now in my grasp. Confusion, depression, and mortal pain are in the past. I shall continue, I shall go on, continue my play, living, not acting, experiencing life each precious day. Act 3. Hello, peace created my heart. Devotion to reality made me whole. Don't visit the asylum. You'll see me as human when my heart stops. Say hi to him, he's in plot 34. The end. Soldiers of the skies. The wind graced my soul and I was born. I fly through destiny's skies with eagle's claws. Dew glistens on the grass of a newly born spring day. I sit in a field staring with enthusiasm as the day is born. Looking back to the days behind me, I stand and wonder, what will this day bring? The coming of dawn, the hope of the day. I look inside to see what has become of my heart. Lightened hearts encourage the laughter of love. Starry skies escape with the birth of dawn. Darkest night gives birth to glorious mornings. Reach for my heart. Embrace my soul.
Thank you for joining us on this, our debut episode of the Poets Cafe. Look for us in February when we plan to start our series. And special thanks again to William Kraft Jr. for sharing his work with us tonight. Thank you, and see you in February.
When I was back there in seminary school, there was a person there who put forth the proposition that you can petition the Lord with prayer. Petition the Lord with prayer. Petition the Lord with prayer. You cannot petition the Lord with